Hi there, everyone. We are seeing our attendance rise very quickly here. I'm Casey Beacock with Sanderson Management. With me is Caitlin Beacock. She deals with the tech side. We're going to give it a few more minutes here for everyone to get in. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We have a great session planned for you, and we can't wait to get started. So just a couple more minutes here. Attendance is still climbing. All right, we seem to be slowing down a little bit. Again, thanks to everyone very much for attending. I'm Casey Beacock with Sanderson Management. Beside me is Caitlin Beacock. She'll be dealing with our tech side tonight. We're really excited for the session we have for you this evening, and we'll get started in just a couple seconds here. All right, well, somehow, the hockey gods were looking upon us when we planned this date and have round two for those Maple Leafs only playing on Tuesday and Thursday, which means all of you were available for tonight to attend our session, and we greatly appreciate that. I know that the Blue Jays are playing this evening, but they aren't at home, so you can, maybe have that on in the TV in the background while you listen to this invigorating session about reserve fund studies. Again, my name is Casey Beacock with Sanderson Management. This is Caitlin Beacock with me doing the tech side of tonight's webinar. And I am happy to get started and introduce our panel to you. What I would like to do first is tell you that sitting on our panel tonight, we have a rock climber, someone who is an avid skier. We have a vocalist and someone who really enjoys to play the guitar. After I do all of our introductions and after you hear them speak, we'll be able to tell you who's who at the end of this session. So here we go. First of all, Jennifer Johnston from Sanderson Management will be your moderator this evening, and she'll be putting us through all of the slides and working with the panelists. Thanks, Jen. Andrew is from Cion, and he has been in engineering and consulting for over 15 years. He's a team lead with Cion Building Engineers and Building Scientists, and he leads a team of project managers and coordinators to facilitate products from conception to completion. He has come to be known as the leak whisperer to some clients to describe his unique skill and approach in his investigative work. Thanks, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you.
Tyler is the Senior Capital Planning Engineer at Brown and Beattie Building Sciences, based out of their Guelph office. Tyler has over 14 years of varied practical engineering experience, and with his history at Brown and Beattie of overseeing building rehabilitation projects of wide varieties, Tyler knew that condos were the place to be. So Tyler is now the capital planning he is the leader of the capital planning team overseeing countless reserve fund studies, performance audit, and building condition assessments. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks.
We also have Ian Miller. Ian is a professional engineer, LEED accredited professional, and a certified construction contract minister with 20 years of experience in building science consulting. He's a project principal and manages the Waterloo office for Pretium Engineering. And of course, a large portion of his work is in assessment and repairs to existing condos, because he also knew that condos was the place to be. Thanks for being with us, Ian.
Happy to be here.
And last, but certainly not least, is Stefan Nespoli as a professional engineer, building science specialist, principal shareholder, and a Grand River office lead with Edison Engineering. He's a member of the local CCI chapter board and loves working with condo boards, condominium managers, and owners to navigate the rough waters found for reserve funds and major project planning, which is exactly what we need in this role that we all play. So thank you very much, Stefan, for being here as well.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Jen, I'm going to pass it over to you as we get on with this. We are going to turn our camera off here because our Wi-Fi signal isn't the best. And so, but we'll still be here listening attentively. See you soon.
When are we guessing their hobbies?
At the end.
At the end. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I am going to share my screen here so we can just take a look at our PowerPoint. And tonight we are going to go through, that we're right at the end. Tonight we are going to start with getting this going. We're going to go through about 8 slides and then we will open it up for some questions. We are going to start with the basics as to what is a reserve fund. Then we're going to take a look at what a reserve fund is with the requirements of the Condominium Act. Then we're going to look at a table and go through what are we looking at. And then reserve funds in today's climate. Then we've got 4 case studies we're going to discuss. Then open it up for questions and end the session with some final words of wisdom. I am going to let Andrew get us started with what is a reserve fund.
Hi, I'm Andrew. So a reserve fund is pretty straightforward. A reserve fund is a long-term budget set by or mandated by the Condo Act to ensure that a condominium has the money in place to be able to handle long-term or large-scale projects like roofing replacements, windows, parking garage, items like that. That's about all it is. I can't really talk more about it because that's about what the system is.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
See, we're starting with the basics.
There you go.
Now we're going to talk, Tyler, take us with reserve funds and the requirements with the Condo Act.
All right. Hi, I'm Tyler. So a reserve fund study, as Andrew said, is required by the Condominium Act. It's required to be done every 3 years, or at least every 3 years. That's the most time that's allowed between studies. And go through a study and actually finalizing that study to create a funding plan. So some folks may have heard of a notice of future funding, which sets out the next 3 years of funding for the reserve. So that's the requirement of the Act every 3 years. There's some different types of studies. So in general, there's a comprehensive study, maybe otherwise known as a Class 1 study. So that's a type of reserve fund study where it's from, let's say, first principles or from scratch. And that would be done when it's a brand new building. They never had a reserve fund study before because it's just newly built. Or perhaps it's the first time that, maybe myself or a consultant's been to the site and they're just starting fresh. Even if a study's been done in the past, they're just kind of taking a new route and doing a comprehensive study. So looking at everything with kind of fresh eyes. So that's a Class 1 or comprehensive study. A Class 2 study, the 2 of the 3, is an update of a study. So we're taking a previous study and we're updating it. So let's say that 3 years has gone by, we're going to update all the timings, all the budgets based on what's happened in the past 3 years and just that time going by, and create a new study. And the important part of I guess the update with the site inspection is you're doing a site inspection. So you're going back out to the site, seeing what all the conditions look like now, as opposed to what it was previously when you're last on site, and updating from there. The third type of study is an update without a site inspection or a Class 3 study. So an update without a site inspection, very clearly, is that same update process that I just described, except we don't actually go out to the site. So the study is kind of what you call maybe an office or a paper update, where as the reserve fund study preparer, we would collect all the information of what's gone on in the past 3 years from management and comments from the board and any wish lists and all these sorts of things, and then create a study that's updated from there just based on that information, but not actually attending the site. And where some of those 3 different studies originate from, especially the updates, is we have that every 3-year requirement. There's also a requirement to complete a site inspection only every 6 years. So typically corporations fall into a pattern of alternating between a update with site inspection and an update without site inspection every 3 years. Then they tick the box on having that study with a site inspection every 6 years, ticking that box for the Condominium Act, and having the study every 3. I will say that there's a note, it's at least every 3 years. Some corporations do decide to do them more frequently. Maybe when there's something large that's changed at the corporation, maybe something unexpected came up that wasn't in the old study, and a board might want to be proactive and get after getting the study updated sooner than that 3-year mark. Often we find our clients that want to update more frequently tend to have a lot going on at the building. So just to take all of that into account as those projects, large projects are getting done, they might update more frequently. And there's always, I guess, corporations that decide every time they have the study done, they just say, you know what, please come out and take a look at our aging corporation, a lot's happening. And maybe they skip the class 3 or the update without site inspection. They just get a class 2 or an update with site inspection done every time. Who can conduct a reserve fund study? So there is a list of within the Condominium Act of who's allowed to do the reserve fund study. I'll list it off really briefly here. You can kind of see based on the composition of our panel tonight, which way perhaps we're leaning, because we're all folks from engineering companies. So it's easy for me to say, get an engineer to do your study, but the Condominium Act does allow for more people than that to do the study. There's accredited appraisers, architects, there's certified engineering technologists. There's, as someone part of the Real Estate Institute of Canada has something called a certified reserve fund planner. They can get a certificate to be a reserve fund planner. Professional quantity surveyors or architectural technologists. That's kind of the very quick list there. And of course, professional engineers. The Professional Engineers of Ontario, PEO, does have a guideline for completing reserve fund studies for professional engineers. So generally within that guideline, it's stated like buildings of a certain type that might have more involved structures or high risk type scenarios would be recommended to have their reserve fund study completed by a professional engineer, just so there's that extra kind of critical eye on everything. Things like high rise type buildings above 4 stories, something with a suspended slab in a parking garage, for example, balconies or other structural elements like this, or kind of high risk buildings, if you will. So that's kind of the definition there. So that's who can do your study. There is an advanced question that came in that I'll just touch on. There was a question about, for the preparer of the study, is there some sort of liability assumed by the company or who is doing the reserve fund study? And the answer generally, especially for professional engineers, is yes. We're working under a certificate of authorization to complete this type of work, and we're experts in this type of engineering. So along with that, we have professional liability insurance. So yes, we're assuming some liability there for the study that we're putting forward. I will also mention that maybe this will maybe come up a little bit later, but the board itself does have some type of liability there too. But putting your faith in listening to professionals that you hire, whether it be engineers or lawyers or all these sorts of things, can help you out there, as well as property management. So that's kind of that. I wanted to touch on a few things here, kind of the bottom 3 points in the slide being critical year, fully funded, catch up. What is all of this? So a reserve fund study, as Andrew mentioned, we're going out, we're figuring out how much things are going to cost, doing budget estimating, and we're figuring out when all this stuff is due, how often are we going to have to do it. That comes up with a technical plan of how we're going to spend all sorts of money over the years to make sure that the building is kept up and things are repaired and replaced as needed. But on the backside of that, we're doing a financial analysis to figure out, okay, we've got the fund spending part done, but now we got to do the saving part so we can save up for all these projects. So what most of our studies are all working on the same kind of financial analysis, where we're doing a cash flow analysis. There's something called a critical year. So typically that critical year, there's some time out over the duration of the study where the balance in the fund hits a low water mark, and that would be called a critical year. Usually it's when there's a large project that's come along and drained down the reserve. That's okay. That's what the reserve's there for, but it becomes a critical year. We want to make sure when we do our financial analysis that that critical year doesn't, go into the red or even get close to zero. We want to have a little buffer there. And that's how we figure out what contributions need to be. That kind of leads to this fully funded and catch-up scenario. And we're going to get into a bit more of this in this slide, so I don't want to steal too much of the next slide's thunder here. But basically, I just want to talk about fully funded or adequately funded and what that means with the Condominium Act. So the Condominium Act in general says that a reserve should be adequately funded. It doesn't necessarily have a perfect definition of what that means. So it's a little bit up to a bit of opinion and interpretation with your reserve fund provider and yourself, and working together to come up with what makes sense. But in general, there's some industry norms of what fully funded means. In general, maybe the best way or the most legal way is to say fully funded means that we're not going to plan for any increases beyond inflationary increases out in the future of the study. We're going to, if there's any catch-up required, which basically means a contribution increase beyond inflation, if any catch-up's required, it happens right away in the year following the year that the study's completed, in the next fiscal year. So that's kind of the most legal way, I guess you could say, is what fully funded means, is you just rip that Band-Aid off, you change the contribution up to whatever level is needed based on our financial analysis right away. There's also an industry norm that's quite acceptable, and it's even stated in the PEO Reserve Fund Preparing Guidelines that it's fairly standard to allow for up to 3 years to spread out those increases. So it's not a big shock to the system of all the ownership right at once in 1 year. There's an accepted industry standard to spread that over 3 years. Idea being that we can tidy up that any catch up, if you will, before we're back again 3 years from now, updating the study again. One caveat to that is for new corporations where the PO guidelines allow for up to a 6-year catch up. And the reason for that more extended or maybe a little bit more leeway there is that new builds have their initial contributions before a reserve fund study is even done, set by the developer. The Condominium Act requires for that first year contribution to the reserve to be only 10% of the operating budget. And we find in every case that it's almost, typically grossly inadequate for what's actually required. It's very, 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 very rare that would ever actually be enough to fund the reserve based on the requirement of the Condominium Act. And that's all the developers have to legally do to follow the Condominium Act. So because it's set so low and we're often ramping up quite high in terms of a percentage increase or, doubling or something like that, there's a bit of leeway there for a bit of a longer catch up for brand new, when you're doing your first new study. I think that's all I had.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And I think that rolls right into what Ian's going to show us here or go through with us with regards to, if I can get my computer to cooperate. There we go. Ian, help us out and tell us what we're looking at. And if you could by chance incorporate some of the points that Tyler was just mentioning, fully funded. Particularly, I'm going to say I can see here that at 2019, I've got an 8%, 2020 an 8%, 2021 an 8%, 2022 an 8%, and then 2023 out, I'm back down to a 2% increase.
Yes. So this is, I tried to take a real reserve fund study, and then I hid most of the rows so that I could condense it onto one screen here. Only showing a couple of different components, and then I sort of manipulated the numbers to give us some of those points that we're talking about. So this isn't actually a real condo, and this isn't actually a real situation, but some of the numbers are real. And so you can see in here, the top row, we have the fiscal year. So this is what year, what's happening, and then down the left side, that first column there is our components. So you see asphalt driveways replaced. And then you see a $57,000 number in the year 2020, which is the first year. This is a study that was being done in 2019. So 2020 would be year one. The next line there, wood fencing replacement, that's a $17,000 cost projected to happen in 2025. And then the asphalt shingle roofing, that's off the charts. It's out there in the future somewhere, but it's not in the next 8 years. And then our window replacement, this is a big one, happening in 2022, $165,000. And then when you go down to the bottom half of the page there, you can see row A is our beginning balance. So that's how much money was in the reserve fund at the start of the year. Adding to that is row B, the annual contribution. So this is the money that comes from the condo fees and going into the reserve fund. So this isn't necessarily all of the condo fees. A portion of your fees are going to the reserve fund and a portion are going to your operations and maintenance components. So this is the portion that's going into the reserve fund. So in 2019, they started with 104,000 and they added another 33,000. They had no other contributions in 2019. And they had the total expenses, we left that blank because this is just sort of establishing our baseline, but you can see what the expenses are expected to be in each of the years going forward. This is a sum of all the upper columns, and those numbers are non-zero because I've hidden all those columns. So you can see those elements on the side. We have numbers 1 through 40, but most of them I've hidden just to make this smaller and simpler to read. So there are expenses that are happening almost every year or every year, but I've just hidden them. That's why you're not seeing what they are. But you can see, for example, in 2022, our total expenses is $213,451. The biggest component of that is that $165,000 window replacement. And then our next line is interest. This would be any interest earned on money that's in the bank, maybe in GICs, whatever it happens to be. So then row F is your total revenue. So all the money coming in. And so then row G in blue there, that's the end balance at the end of the year. So how much money did you start with? How much money came in? How much money was spent? And the result is how much money you have at the end of the year. And when you look at the blue number for the year 2022, you can see that's low. That's down at 14,120. And so for a fairly substantial condo, that's a pretty low amount. That's your house owner with like $500 in the bank saving up for his home repairs. So divided by the number of units, that's a pretty low number. And so you can see in the graph at the bottom, that's our bottom out number. This is what Tyler was talking about. This is our critical year. This is the low point in the graph. And so we always need to be saving up for that low point in the graph. And in this imaginary scenario, that's because we have, a significant amount of money being spent in 2020 on the asphalt, some more money being spent in 2021 that the rows are hidden, and then a big cost coming out in 2022. So this is depleting the reserve fund study. And when we say that if the reserve fund has to be fully funded, that means that, if that cost was, say, down in 2027, we can't just say, well, that's the future owner's problem. Unfortunately, we need to make sure that the reserve fund is balanced so that the money is there today for the spending that needs to happen in the future. We can't just push that down onto future owners. And so that's why when you look in the 2020 column under other contributions, you see that bolded $20,000. This is in addition to the regular reserve fees. This is some other contribution. This might be a special assessment. This might be a condominium loan that's happening. But either way, this condominium is coming up with an extra $20,000 as a catch up to get them into that fully funded situation. And if they didn't do that, then our graph would be going below zero in 2022, which again would be a problem. And so you can also see that we have those annual contributions, 8% increases for the next 3 years, in addition to that $20,000 annual contribution, probably a special assessment. After that, we're able to bring it back down to 2% for inflation. And so you can sort of see a combination of strategies is used here. We're increasing fees by 8% for the next few years, 3 years as we're allowed. But we're also doing that that special assessment of $20,000 as a catch up. And the other option would have been to say, no, we're just doing 2% every year. We want to keep the fees low and only do a special assessment, but that $20,000 number would have to be a little bit higher. Or the other alternative would be to say, no, we're going to do big increases for the next 3 years. And that might be 50% increases for 3 years, but then we don't have to do special assessment. But then you have high fees continuing, which isn't necessarily a good thing. So we work with the condominiums and we figure out what's the best situation for you. But this is, in general, how you're reading this graph. And I'm sure this is the spreadsheet that comes out of the Pretium Reserve Fund study, but I'm sure those completed by, Cion, Brown and Beattie and Edison all look pretty similar. So
Ian, a quick question here for you that's come in on the Q&A. Does fully funded just mean greater than 0, or is there a mandatory buffer?
There is a minimum amount that you need to keep in the reserve, but the other gentleman here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a specific number. It depends on the condominium and the size of the number of site component, the number of common element components, sorry. Like if you have a fairly simple condominium that's, say, a townhouse condominium, and the only common element components are, say, the roof and the parking lot, then you don't need to save up quite as much versus if you have a high-rise condominium that has a lot of common element components. You've got hallway lighting, carpeting, site elements, roofing, mechanical systems, all those sorts of things, windows, balconies. Then you would want to make sure you have a little bit more of a buffer because you're really never allowed to have that drop below 0. So you want to make sure that you have some buffer in the future. Andrew, it looked like you were going to speak up there.
I mean, I think you actually you covered it right in the last sentence there. The act mandates that you just have to be in the black. So if you have $1 in your reserve, the act states that's fine. But the majority of us consultant firms try and put it in contingency for your work or the projects being done to account for a little bit of a buffer in case those projects don't go exactly to price as people anticipate them to go. So that's kind of an assistant measure that helps the condominiums and the property managers when they're running through the budgetary numbers, at the end of month end every year.
Exactly. And as anybody who's gone through this for a few years can, I'm sure, attest, it's rare that, there's work that's projected that doesn't have to happen, but it's not unheard of for something to come up that wasn't expected. And the something that comes up that's not expected isn't necessarily in your reserve fund, but it still has to get paid. So that's why it's nice to have that buffer.
I can jump in as well. I just wanted to say that, the act doesn't mandate a minimum amount. There is judgment applied to what adequately funded means, but one other factor to consider is what major expenditures do you have coming up and what's their timing compared to the critical year. So if you have, if your roof replacement is planned 5 years from now and you don't have much money in your reserve today, well, that's a real risk that item fails sooner than you expect. And you don't really have a choice when your roof fails, you need to repair it. So, being mindful of where your low balance is compared to your expenditures can provide some insight as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because if your asphalt starts to go, you can probably live with a potholed parking lot for a couple of years, but a leaky roof, you can't just put up with it. It's something that you really need to deal with.
So sorry for stepping on Ian there. Well, when my turn comes around, feel free to just jump all over.
No, I welcome input from
If you guys are okay, I think we need to move on to our next one here with Stefan. And I do see there are some other questions that are coming in through the Q&A. Please keep them coming. And so a lot of them are going to get addressed as we continue on, but if we don't get them addressed, we'll definitely circle back to them. So our next one here is, what's the deal in today's climate? What is going on?
Thanks, Jennifer. Yep, the nice straightforward slide for me. So to start us off, these are two items that we haven't yet really touched on too much, and those are the critical assumptions that go into every study, which are for inflation and for interest. And those can have a really big impact on what your future expenditures are and how that impacts today's contributions. So speaking more broadly, construction price inflation has significantly outpaced consumer price inflation over the last 3 years. So what we hear about in the news is consumer price inflation. So your groceries, your gas, and the news has been reporting, and we've all been feeling in our pocketbook how rapidly that increase has been happening. Construction out price inflation has been far beyond that. So for example, consumer price index from Stats Canada was at 5.2% in 2021 and 6% in 2022. Contrast that with the construction price index, which was at 25.7% in 2021 and 21.9% in 2022. Those figures are for Toronto, which is the closest municipality that's listed on StatsCan, and it does apply to the Grand River region. So any reserve fund studies that are being done this year, next year, 2025, are going to have to reflect this significant increase in cost, whether your projects are happening in the near term or in the long term. This is a cost that is here. It has arrived and will be implemented into your reserve fund study if it's not there already. So no doubt this is not an easy thing, right? The resulting increases in contributions are going to be difficult to communicate to owners. They're going to be difficult for owners to accommodate, especially considering owners are under other financial pressures right now related to consumer price inflation, increasing mortgage rates. I know in Toronto, I've heard stories that some unit owners are already having to move out and move back in with parents if they're young condo owners who have just bought. And I'm sure that's coming to this region as well. The reality here is that condominiums that were already behind on your reserve funding or haven't caught up, as Tyler and as Ian have been talking about, aren't up to speed on the changes that have been happening, are going to find that this is just going to compound your problems. And successful condos are going to be the ones that are able to tackle this and address it head on. And of course, that's not going to be easy though. So one of the questions that came in was interested in how inflation is affecting reserve fund studies and how boards can plan for that when there are so many unknowns. So great, right? We need the ray of sunshine now after my dark cloud there. So what can we do? Well, first of all, as Andrew was saying, work with your engineer. So we need to be collaborative. You need to look at what can we reasonably defer. As Ian mentioned, your asphalt pavements, can we proceed with some localized repairs instead? Is it really important that we have, beautiful new roadways in our community, or can we manage at least not having potholes, right? What impact does that have on our contributions? That's reasonable. It's less reasonable to defer, a structural repair program or your roof replacement, things like that. So try to be reasonable there. Educate your owners. So help everybody understand what's happening and why this is coming down. And ultimately implement the increases, because that's going to be the best course of action. I think we've seen, and I'm sure everyone else on the call can attest, that delaying increases is only shown to result in financial failure, physical decline. And when you're trying to implement these increases, feel free to invite your engineer to present at a town hall. Let us take the flack from your owners and give us the opportunity to explain and help them understand where this is coming from. Moving on to interest. So one of the questions that came up was, what's a reasonable long-term interest rate? High interest rates reduce current fees, pushing higher costs onto future owners. GIC rates have not been in the 4 to 5% range for many years, except in recent months, which will be short-lived. So this is a fantastic question as well, right? It's difficult to set the inflation assumption, and then how do we set the interest assumption? So let me start by saying again, first of all, nobody has a crystal ball. And two, the Act protects us against making bad assumptions by mandating that we update the study at least every 3 years. So we don't have to live with the assumptions forever. That's why we're constantly updating these documents. So some things that go into picking an interest rate. So what has your actual interest income been in recent years? Is that reasonable to assume for the next 3 years? Is always a good starting point. One other factor is, do you have a lot of expenditures coming up soon? So are there a lot of dollars in, dollars out? Are the dollars that are in your reserve fund now going to be spent in the next couple of years through major projects? Or do you have a window of opportunity where you're maybe a newer complex and you're investing money now to sit there for 10 or 15 years to save up for some major projects? If you have a longer investment time horizon, you may have access to some higher interest earning vehicles, and maybe a higher interest assumption makes sense for you. If you're in the building renewal phase and you're going through a number of major projects, you don't have time to invest, then maybe a lower interest rate makes more sense for you. So it's about trying to customize to what your reality is going to be. Finally, you want to consider how your interest assumption compares to your inflation assumption. My experience has been that trying to keep them close, within 0.5% or 1%, keeps things generally in balance between future owners and current owners. And when you get more of a spread than that, you know, if, as the person who submitted the question mentioned, you know, if you assume much higher interest rates, it just pushes costs onto future owners and can sort of sugarcoat the study. And so I find having those assumptions much closer, maybe 3% interest, 3.5% inflation right now is something that would be reasonable. And then construction industry. So question here was, we've all heard about the labor, material cost, and annual inflation increases. How will these increases affect the reserve fund in the future? How much of an increase can we expect to meet rising costs? So certainly a number of factors have impacted the construction industry recently and resulted in driving up these prices. So retirement of baby boomers is having an impact. There's been global factors, the war in Ukraine, some climate disasters that have impacted some international material suppliers has, believe it or not, had an impact locally. Political tensions, the list goes on. Haven't mentioned COVID-19 yet, but that certainly had an impact on supply chains. So these factors are all you know, having direct impact on prices, and they're also causing contractors to build in a risk factor into their pricing, because when a contractor submits a price, they have to honor that. And you know, their suppliers are not being as fair with them a lot of the time. And so we're getting into some messy situations where projects are getting stalled because suppliers are forcing down cost increases onto contractors who didn't have that built into their agreement with a client. Bottom line, what we're seeing is about a 30 to 50% increase on a one-year basis in reserve fund studies, basically across the board. And I've talked to other consultants about this. You know, the others on the call can feel free to jump in, but that's what we're seeing as being very normal right now. It's substantial. It's also the reality that we're seeing. That's across all kinds of different project types, whether it be window replacement, roof replacement, concrete work, sealants. You know, certainly lumber has been quite volatile, but on the broad spectrum of your reserve fund, 30 to 50% on a one-year basis is what we're seeing across the board.
So Stefan, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Totally cutting you off. So to tie a couple of things in, we did have a question come across here on the Q&A as well, that pre-COVID CPI was 9%. With your crystal balls, do you think things might revert back to this level? And or if I'm on a board and I just did a reserve fund, it's not due for another 2 years. Do you think I should be doing another reserve fund earlier to start capturing some of the increases that are more than likely coming to try to make it up now, or wait till later?
Yeah, great questions. So first question about my crystal ball. And the question basically that I'm hearing is, are prices coming back down? And there may be some prices that come back down, but I don't think we're looking at broad-based deflation. I don't think, you know, prices across the economy are going to decrease. I think the rate of inflation is going to slow. I think that's what the Bank of Canada is trying to do, and that's what governments are working toward, is slowing the rate of inflation, not deflating costs. So I think on a one-off basis, some costs are going to be volatile and come back down, but I wouldn't expect that broadly, and certainly wouldn't on a reserve fund planning basis, would not plan for that. Your other question about how often is a good one, and I'm going to get to it in just a second. I just wanted to make one other comment on the broad-based increase that's impacting all condos right now. I compare it to when the HST was implemented. So the HST came into effect and it affected all condos. You didn't have the option to just continue with an inflation-only assumption because there was more tax you had to pay on all of your projects all of a sudden. And I remember meeting with boards when the HST was implemented and they were refusing to, you know, go above inflation. We've never done that. We've, you know, our owners trust us because we've only ever had inflation increases. And we're going, but but the basic project cost has changed because you have to pay more tax now because the HST has been implemented. And to me, that's similar today. Is there isn't you know, an option. There's a clear explanation. Costs have gone up across the board, and this is impacting everybody. So, and then just to echo what Tyler said earlier, the best thing you can do is to make sure that by the time you do your next study, you're caught up on everything we know today. So there's a ton of volatility. There's been a ton of change in the past few years. Just make sure by the time your next study is done, or by the time that 3-year window is up, you've caught up on all of those known changes, and you're ready to start tackling whatever happens between, you know, now and 3 years from now. So then how often do we update the study? Tyler touched on this a bit as well. You know, recent pricing has been heavily influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Where we go from here now that the pandemic is winding down is still uncertain. You know, there's still a lot of, you know, a strong lack of clarity of where the economy is going. So what I would say is at this point, if you're due to update your study in the next 1 or 2 years, sooner is better than later, because there will be increases coming and it's better to get ahead of it. As a general rule, 3 years is still reasonable unless you're in the building renewal phase and you have lots of major construction projects ongoing or planned in the near future. You know, if there are, you know, Tyler touched on this as well, to have a site visit every time you're updating your study when you're in that building renewal phase. So if you have lots of projects planned in the next few years, just get the reserve fund planner out to site, get your engineer out there. On a relative basis, reserve fund studies are low cost, I'll say, or high value maybe is better for the panelists here. And, you know, as Andrew mentioned as well, we're here to work with you. You know, we're your partners in this. The reserve fund is a living document. We want to make sure it's staying updated and staying current as the market changes. We're here to help you adapt and accommodate those changes.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And now we're ready. Let's roll into, I believe it's even your first case study.
It is. Thank you. So
it's going to eventually flip screens here.
I was going to read it.
There you go.
Quickly snake a glass of water. Ah, too late.
So as a board, we aren't comfortable with the increases that the engineer is proposing. When I put the table into Excel, I can run our reserve fund studies and we come out much lower. I am not approving the study. So, you know, raise your hand if you're on the call and this is you, maybe, but this is something that comes up not infrequently. And, you know, we recently had a client who took our study, put it in Excel, and had sent us back their plan, their version of the plan, and the increases on an annual basis were upwards of 7%. And, you know, it just didn't come close to meeting the intent of the Act or the Professional Engineers Ontario guideline that Tyler touched on. And this was after, you know, a couple of meetings and some rounds of education, and so the message wasn't getting through. When you are considering, when you get a draft that you have questions about or you're not happy with, you know, summarize your feedback with your fellow board members and arrange a meeting or send that feedback to your engineer and begin that process of customizing the draft to suit your needs, and also to, you know, learn where we were coming from and why we put the numbers in that we did. You know, absolutely ask questions when you have them and scrutinize that information. But when boards consider implementing a study that isn't endorsed by their engineer, they take on personal liability. So, you know, one of the questions earlier was, do engineers have insurance for things like this? Absolutely, we do. That's part of what you pay us for to do this. The Act mandates that we have a certain level of insurance. And so when board members do the reserve fund study on their own, or they say that they're not following the professionals' advice, you take on personal liability. It's a really terrible idea. There are better ways, if you're not happy with the draft study, to implement a reserve fund study. You do need to have a reserve fund study implemented. It gets added as a note on your status certificate, can affect possible future sales. And the best path forward really is to summarize your feedback as cleanly as possible with your fellow board members, send it to your engineer, and either arrange a meeting or have some back and forth until you arrive at a plan that works.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I believe we have Tyler up for our next case study.
Yes. So I just wanted to chat about something that has come up in the past and we've had to deal with. So in this study.
Sorry, Tyler, I'm going to totally cut you off. Can you also then maybe when you're going through this one, give a bit of an idea? Tony asked as well, if you could ballpark, if someone could ballpark, you maybe already answered this ballpark. If you had a $1 million project in 2020, what do you think the ballpark would be in today's cost?
Oh, we're us engineers. We're so good at just ballparking without any caveats. Yeah, I was actually just typing an answer to that, but I'll just talk to it. Maybe I'll just mention that first. I mean, Stefan has the best line, which is we don't have that crystal ball. I know you're talking about something in 2020 and what it is today. So I guess we could look retroactively. I'm going to look a little bit farther back, and this doesn't really answer your question, but just gives you a bit of an idea. StatsCan has lots of cool stats, and some of it refers to construction industry. It's not necessarily restoration construction industry that we're dealing with built buildings and fixing them, but it's a general idea that we can try to use. They collect data on construction inflation for major city centers across Canada, the closest one being Toronto for us. So that's the one that would apply. So from the period between 2017 to 2020, so this is pre-COVID, construction inflation in the Toronto area was about 44%. So if something was $1 million in 2017, perhaps we could ballpark that it would be about 1.44 million in 2020. And things have gone up since then. So that's kind of an idea of what it was like between those times. And that's just based on StatsCan. It's very, very general. This isn't, particular projects are going to completely change what that increase would be based on the materials that you're dealing with, maybe even labor of certain specialized laborers that you need to do your work, depending on what the project is. So things have gone up probably more than that. That's kind of retroactively looking at hard numbers for general construction inflation from that time period. I guess it doesn't really answer your question necessarily because there's just too many variables with just the what if, but that's a general idea from some historical StatsCan from kind of, that's the most recent that we have now, I believe, up till that point. And then just to go into this.
Nope, go ahead. Okay. Tell us about how we're funding our water project.
Yeah, so this is like a little case study of this is a townhouse corporation. Townhouse corporations have domestic water mains buried somewhere throughout the grounds, under the roadways usually, or through the front yards to provide fresh water to all the different townhouses. Water in, and then they have, of course, the storm sewers water out. Water mains are hidden, and there's something that the corporation is typically responsible for in a typical townhouse corporation, usually up to the water stop for the individual unit, something like that. So all the general trunk lines are the corporation's responsibility, and they are, of course, buried, and that's a high pressure pipe providing water to the unit, so they're not readily accessible. First of all, they're buried underground, so when one of us is wandering around your site, we can't see what they look like because they're underground. And they're not like a sewer where we can stick a camera down and scope out and see how the sewer looks, see if there's cracks or that sort of thing. Because it's a high pressure line, they're smaller and that sort of thing. It's not an easy thing to assess. You can always do a test pit, but that's just showing us one little spot throughout a site, and the cost is usually pretty high to do that. So what can happen is that we get into a situation where a corporation's spending oodles of money, maybe over the years, on water main breaks, and seeing a pattern where that's increasing and increasing. In this particular case, there was a few years at a corporation between reserve fund studies where they started to just have many failures and made the decision that this is too much to just keep coming back on an emergency basis, dealing with water mains and folks not having water and this sort of thing. And they just said, we've got to do this whole project, and took on a general water main replacement type project. This is an older site, 40 plus years old. So some questions, obviously large cost. And then in the reserve fund, it's a bit of an unknown. So for any of us to say at a brand new townhouse corporation, all right, at year 50, we know that the water mains are all going to fail. We can't really say that. It could be that they start failing sooner. It could be that we never have to do a general replacement project before, the site is raised to make way for the new bright and shiny thing 100 years from now. But we have to have some type of allowance for that. In this case, it wasn't projected for a general replacement type project in the short term in the reserve fund study. We did have allowances built in that escalated over time in terms of cost as the site aged to help deal with water main breaks. But this corporation in the past had decided not to go with a big lump sum of, over $1 million as a what if in case they needed to do this, because it's a concealed type project. How are we going to fund this project? So in this case, what ended up happening was the work needed to be done. There were too many water main breaks. They had to go ahead and do the project. So that's kind of we can't really put it off. It just needs to be done because they're just spending too much on the fixes and they want it to be done with all the inconvenience and so on, and the expense of just putting, localized repairs in. They wanted to go ahead with the big project. How did they fund the project? Well, we of course worked with them in the reserve fund study. There were contribution increases to help fund for this work. However, in the short term, the immediate short term, the cost was too high for the reserve to absorb. So what they ended up doing was going to get financing. So the corporation took out a loan tied directly to the project. They worked with a lender that deals only with condominium lending. So they're kind of an expert in that sort of thing to stick handle their way through it. There were steps along the way that the corporation had to do, putting into place a borrowing bylaw, which basically meant getting the ownership to agree to take the loan out. It's not just that the board of directors can do that necessarily on their own. They have to get a bylaw to be able to do that. So they went through that whole process, took out a loan that's now payable back over a longer period of time and blended into the reserve. So that loan's being paid back over time. It's avoiding a huge spike where, it might have been a special assessment of tens of thousands of dollars per unit, and spreading that out over the long term with the fact that these new domestic water mains and buried systems should last a good long while now that they're installed. So, we're going to be paying it off for a little while, but we're going to have those new pipes now when we need them. And that helped mitigate the impact on the reserve fund and kind of spread that cost out over time. That's how that problem was dealt with.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Next one we have is, we have an older condominium here, and I believe, Andrew, you're going to talk to us about this one. Another leak. Water, my nemesis.
Water's my friend. It really is. So this case study is actually from my condominium. So I'm the board president for my condominium board in Halton. And this was a situation where the previous board president was on the board for 27 years and had taken legal advice from a previous lawyer who had told him that the windows are actually not part of the declaration. They're not part of the condo, and they do not need to be covered under the reserve fund. In the 80s, early 80s, declarations loved to differentiate between the window frame and the glass, right? This was because someone broke the glass, the board or the condominium should not be responsible for that glass if a unit owner broke it. Unit owner should pay for it. But when you get to these funny declarations where you run into a scenario where you're looking at replacing these windows, do you back charge the client for the glass specifically? Windows come with glass. How do you deal with this? We were now not only in that scenario, but in a scenario where our windows are starting to leak and they failed. they're way too old for what's going on. They're leaking air, and our reserve fund did not have funding for them at all. So as Tyler said, there's lots of different avenues you can take in terms of looking at these costs. But when we took the cost of the reserve fund and redid our reserve fund, we did it early. We had already just completed a class 2. Been dropped on the board, and first question was, where's our windows on the reserve? So we had to redo it. The funds were reallocated, and yes, there was an increase, but the increase was actually nominal compared to what we were receiving. So our window job is actually anticipated just to go off in 4 phases. We've retained engineering firms or are interviewing currently engineering firms to be able to go through that project. I know that sounds ridiculous that I work for Cion and that's the case, but I do it for a living and don't want to do it when I get home. So the process for that will just net an increase over the total of 3 years of $60 a month. But the sale to all the unit owners was, you are paying $60 a month more, yes, in your condo fees, but you're getting your windows fixed and you're getting them fixed now, not later, not when the reserve fund didn't account for it. And we were also fortunate because our reserve fund was actually built and handled very well. And the board previously had actually done the capital projects noted on the reserve fund almost to a T in the timeline. We didn't really have a lot of scary expenditures that popped up. So we were able to balance that and move some things around when we needed to. The biggest point of that was those kind of scenarios would not have been picked up if the people who lived in the houses were speaking to the property managers saying, we may have a problem, and reaching out in communication to your professionals to state, should we be looking at this? Is this an issue? In this case, we had to bring in solicitors. The lawyers had to be brought in to confirm what our declaration said, if you could believe it or not. Right. And at the end of that, yes, it was found that the windows had to be on the reserve. They had to be added. There was no choice. A mistake made by one person 27 years ago, taking advice, affected an entire community of 93 units 30 years later, 27 years later. So the point of this entire story is we can always work with any community, any one of these professionals will work with the community and the property management firms to understand what those requirements are for your reserve fund, but mainly what you're looking for in your community. And then if those changes had to adapt, then we could provide as professionals different options for you to fund that. It may be a special assessment, as scary words that no one wants to hear, right? But as Tyler was saying, a borrowing bylaw or financing a project is actually very feasible these days in terms of what we're dealing with the financial situations and the inflation rates.
Quick question, Andrew. So in this situation, the takeaway I'm hearing from you is you're in a situation and you discover that you come to the conclusion that the windows should have been in the reserve fund study.
Yeah.
So the first thing you did was you did a reserve fund study.
So the first thing I did,
you didn't necessarily wait. I guess what I'm saying, you didn't
No.
wait until your 3-year period. You said,
no.
well, we need this in a reserve fund study, or we need to get this analyzed.
I will step one step further. Now, I have the advantage of being in this industry for long enough to kind of be able to skip a couple steps with my own board. The first step in any situation that you see that might be a capital expense that's maybe noted or not noted on your reserve fund, that may have to come down the line earlier, your first call is, as a board member, is to your manager. Your second call from your manager is to your consulting engineer or whoever the expert is in that area, because we need to come in and actually, as professionals, determine whether that situation is actually bad or not. And the gentleman on here can attest to the amount of times we've been to a site and someone thought their building was coming down and it was just a hairline crack from expansion and contraction in concrete. And no, it's okay. Everything's fine. This isn't Florida, right? Engaging your engineer, 9 times out of 10, those engineering firms will come out typically free of charge just to take a look because they like the relationship with the communities they're dealing with. And when they come out to take a look, they're going to give you an assessment pretty quickly. If that assessment takes more than a couple hours, those engineers are going to start charging you, and rightfully so. As Stefan said, and as I believe Ian mentioned earlier, we carry the liability of these things. We have to be sure that what we're suggesting is accurate. The difference is if a board member takes the judgment call without contacting a professional in a situation that could be, not advantageous, I'll put it. You could take on those liabilities as a board member yourself. And as the act changed in 2017, those liabilities start getting a bit scarier as you're, a board member, right? You really want to waive those liabilities off. Sorry, Quick answer is yes, get a condition assessment for your assemblies if anything is scaring you about what's going on or just even concerning you. Nowadays, we can fire a photo over email pretty quickly and take a look.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And our final case study here is, I believe, Ian, you're going to give us a rundown here.
Yes, this situation, we really need to upgrade our corporation's electrical. With electric vehicle requirements that are coming, we need EV charging stations ASAP. It's a good thing we have lots of money in the reserve fund study. Unfortunately, this situation has come up a number of times, whether it's we want to add EV charging stations, we want to put in a pool, we want to put in a tennis court, you know, whatever it happens to be. Unfortunately, if it's not an existing common element, then it can't come out of the reserve fund study. The reserve fund study exists only to pay for the maintenance and repair and replacement of existing common elements. So we can't add new things, we can just maintain existing things. And that's, you know, that's in part because it's not, it's all the current owner's responsibility to pay for those future expenses to maintain the building down the road. But someone who bought into that property didn't necessarily buy into, you know, a property that has a pool or a tennis court or whatever it happens to be, or charging stations. So if you want to add something like that, it depends on the condominium's bylaws. But generally you would need the residents to agree that they want to do this improvement, and then you would need to save up separately. And that can be done, you know, you can do a special assessment for something like that, or you can save up for it over time. But again, it would have to be a separate saving amount, not part of the reserve fund. So hopefully that's, you know, a fairly quick answer to that question, because it's come up a few times with a couple of different potential new elements. But yeah, it's a pretty straight answer. If it's not an existing element, it can't be paid out of the reserve fund.
So then I have another question that we've received quite a few of them, and you've maybe said it, but I just would like to see if you want to reiterate it again. How do you determine what's an operating expense versus a reserve fund expense?
So I would say, in my opinion, it is somewhat subjective. If you're talking about, say, a mechanical unit, this is something I answered in the Q&A there. If you have a mechanical unit and the fan belt needs replacing, that's a maintenance item, that's a operating expense. If the unit itself needs to be replaced, it's a capital expenditure, and so it's a reserve fund component. The gray area comes in a question that one of the other panelists, I don't remember who, sorry, answered about, you know, if a front door, for example, needs to be replaced. Well, is it one unit front door that needs to be replaced, or is it all the unit front doors? All the unit front doors is definitely a capital expense and coming out of the reserve fund study, assuming those are a common element. If it's one door, you know, is that a capital expense or is that a maintenance item? And what if it's just the door handle? What if it's the hinge? You know, it becomes this gray area. You know, if you're just replacing the deadbolt, I would think that's an operating expense. If you're replacing all the doors, it's a capital expenditure. Somewhere in between, it's hard to say. And then in the chat, somebody's also asked, if you add expensive EV chargers not paid from the reserve fund, do future reserve fund studies automatically add that to the next study? So yes, if that is added as a common element owned by the corporation, then it has to be maintained and repaired as it breaks down and needs replacement over time. So yes, that would get added to future reserve fund studies.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian.
Mm-hmm.
I would say now, if there's any other questions that you'd like some answers for, definitely keep using the Q&A here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But I do have some other questions that were given here in advance, and I'm going to throw out here to the panel. A very popular question that we received many different ways was, and I do think we've answered this, but it wouldn't hurt to hit this home one more time. Well, anyway, is the reserve fund study a guide, or does it need to be followed as is? Who wants it?
Oh, come on. Yeah, okay. You do it, Stefan, you go ahead.
All right, I'll take it. It's absolutely a roadmap. It's a guide. It's a living document. If we've said to replace your roof in 3 years and your roof's not leaking and you've got the money there in case it does fail and you've got some tolerance for leaks, you don't have to replace it. Similarly for any other building component. If you want to replace your garage doors sooner and the funding is there, I would say it's worth checking in with your consultant before moving a major project around, just to make sure that there's not some other knock-on effect that's going to happen. But certainly there can be a lot of latitude, especially when you're not approaching your critical year. Costs can move around without really impacting the long-term funding plan.
Well, thank you. Another one with regards to obviously the reserve fund. Why does the reserve fund have to go out so far in advance? And can we insist that our reserve fund engineers extend the project plans to 40 years from 30 years? So I know myself this past year, I've had a lot of questions back and forth with the 40-year plan versus a 30-year plan. And how can we manipulate the numbers so we have the least amount of increases is what it seemed like. So
I'll maybe chime in here because I know Jennifer, you and I worked on one like that. So maybe there's some folks here tonight. So in general, like let's start from like the required minimum is the Condominium Act requires a minimum of 30 years. So we have to look 30 years out. Why do we have to even look 30 years out? Why not just 5 or 10 or something like that? Generally, it's because a lot of these building components last a good long while if they're maintained properly, installed properly to begin with, and so on. And if we cut off our analysis after 10 years, let's say on a new high-rise, for example, there might barely be anything on the board that we're saving for because it's all out beyond that 10 or even maybe 20-year mark for a lot of the major building components. So when we're talking about some of these building components, whether it's a small site or a big site, the whole idea with the reserve fund is that you are saving up for those different components so that you have the money to pay for them when they come due. So we have to look out in the long term to make sure that we're capturing those items as they're scheduled far out in the future, and we're starting to save up for them now. We don't want to be caught short and then only have 5 years to save up for the garage that was 25 years down the road, but we're only looking at 20, and it comes online, after the building's 5 years old. Well, now it's within that 20-year window, but we only have 20 years to save up for what should be a 25-year project. The savings rate's got to go up because we kind of had the blinders on beforehand. 30 years to 40 years, I definitely agree with that. We generally recommend going beyond 30 years because a lot of building components should be lasting a little bit longer than that in terms of the long-term planning for them, which is exactly what a reserve fund study is supposed to be doing. We go a little bit further than that even. But yes, the minimum from the Act is 30, but we recommend going farther just to make sure we're capturing everything. In general, if you go out farther, I guess at some point, if you do have a cutoff, there's always going to be that item where 3 years later, when you update your study, it was off the chart before. Now it's, if your study goes 50 years, now it's at year 48, and all of a sudden it's appeared. We have 48 years to save up for it. If we're only at 30 years, now we have 28 years to save up for it, which is less. So the longer you go out, the more, I guess, comprehensive your study will look, because you're making sure you're budgeting for all these things that sometimes have very long life cycles. And as buildings age as well, you can think if there's a 30-year item that we're saving up for in 5 years from now, but we're in really good shape, there's going to be at year 35, the next instance of that item is going to be online. Maybe it's a big cost, and we want to make sure we're capturing both of those, maybe both instances of those future, the upcoming replacement and the future, so that we make sure that our plan is robust for the long term. It's kind of the idea.
Tyler, and I think Andrew, did you want to add something?
A lot of us in the industry right now are actually anticipating some changes in the regulations that are coming out. And one of those changes will be to extend the reserve fund to the effective life of the longest age item on your reserve fund. So that issue won't, hopefully we're anticipating that issue will not happen anymore, of that fall off of those projects that Tyler was speaking of earlier. It'll be mandated that it's part of the act now, but those regs are still not in place. We're just hoping they are coming out soon.
Perfect.
There was I was just
Okay.
gonna say there was a recent submission to the ministry actually from a few consultants, but some local condos included that agreed to share their uninflated expenditure costs, just to help show the ministry the difference between from, you know, the birth of a condo, what the expenditures are over the 30-year period versus 45 versus 60, and how bad it is if you're only looking 30 years, you know, what the impact is compared to looking at 45 from day one versus compared to looking at 60 from day one. So the work is happening, it's slow.
Yeah, of course, change is always slow.
I want to just switch gears and bounce back here for a second. And Ian, I'm going to come your way. I think I just saw it. I assume if a network, my network's crashing here on me. It's in the Q&A. If a change is required by code, the question was, can that come out of the reserve fund?
I'm not sure what would be a new element that's required by code. That would be it's pretty rare that you would see something like that. I'm trying to think of an example. I haven't seen that that I can think of, but typically if it's a new element, it wouldn't be coming out of the reserve. I'm not sure if Helena, if you're able to give an example of what the component would be that is required by code. Typically, most building components are grandfathered in, like railing requirements and accessibility requirements, things like that are essentially, you know, if you're replacing your guards, you need to upgrade them to new code. But most of the time, code doesn't require you to add something to a building unless it's a major safety item like an elevator upgrade. But that's an existing element, like an elevator.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. I am just looking here for another one I had. This was on the chat there as well, on the Q&A, and I think it was maybe answered, but I think it's probably worthwhile for everyone to hear, basically around, like, what's the consideration if the board wants to upgrade rather than simply maintain or replace what they have listed in the reserve fund study? Are there any particular rules around the upgrade portion? Andrew, you put your finger up.
So the term upgrade is a scary term used towards reserve fund planners. Technically by the act, the term upgrade states that we are changing a common element to be a better version of that common element, which we are not allowed to do. Now, that being said, there are changes to materials that occur over time that we have to adjust. And my best example for this, and most of us here use it, is single pane windows. If we go to a condo and there's single pane windows, I'm sorry, but there is no act, there is nothing out there that's going to get me to put single pane windows back in your building again. It's considered an upgrade in every essence of the word, but we can't put in single pane windows. Code has changed, and that's just not acceptable anymore unless you're a heritage house and you're specifically requesting it, right? So some of these upgrades, similar with lighting, we can't change your lighting as an upgrade to your facility. However, you can change your lights to LED fixed units because that's what's cost effective, as long as it remains in the cost of the budget of the reserve. Now, if you're putting more monies to it, so say your reserve calls for $10,000, and we'll use lights again, $10,000 for lights, and everyone in the community really wants those really expensive $40,000 worth of lights. Well, your reserve will cover 10 grand of that. The additional 30,000 has to be funded from somewhere else, whether be it special assessments, raffle drive, bake sale, whatever needs to be done to raise the money, right? But the reserve is only allocating the funds for what was built and what will be replaced from what is built.
So we're having a bake sale over at your condominium.
You would believe the funds you make from making cookies and Rice Krispie squares, people.
Okay, so I think we probably should look to start wrapping this up with some final words of wisdom. I do know we've got Q&As that are still coming in. I think they're going to try to get answered here, and we'll go from there. So I'm looking at my screen, so I'm going to go with Stefan. Can you give us a final word of wisdom?
Certainly, and I hope I'm not stepping on
You get to go first. You get it all.
on
Say
toes
all
of
of your
others
words of
here.
wisdom.
Let's see. What I would say is do your condition assessments. So it's come up a few times tonight, but I'll try to drive this point home. There's a lot of uncertainty in costs, but a reserve fund study is a high level look at all of your building components. It's not a in-depth review that reviews options for timing and cost, and can we refurbish the windows versus replacing them? Can we, defer the asphalt project by doing localized repairs and seal cracks to extend life? You'll get more accurate cost data, more accurate options, and then you can move those options into your reserve fund to see which option best works for your community. So when you have projects coming up in that 5 to even 10-year window, you start doing your condition assessments and really get a good idea of what that is actually going to look like to implement that project.
Perfect. Thank you. Ian, words of wisdom.
I would say more information is almost always better. If you have a piece of information and you're like, oh, I don't know if this is relevant or not, send it on through. If we don't have it, we can't do anything with it. But if we do have it, we can say, oh, that's not relevant, and we can throw it away. Or we can say, wow, that's actually really helpful. We can use that. An example being maybe you had a quote done to replace your shingle roofs, but it was 5 years old. We do have information about how much it costs to replace shingle roofs these days. But if you have a quote that's specific to your site, that's specific to the peaks and valleys of your roof, we can take that information with the information we have about the current price of shingles, combine it together and get the most accurate number for you. Yes, it's a 5-year-old quote, but more information is always better. If you have it, send it over.
Perfect. Thank you. Andrew, what do you
Ask
have?
questions. That is the easiest thing to throw out there. And it's the same thing that we throw out to people learning in the industry. Ask questions. Without asking the questions, you can't be informed. And without asking the questions, we don't know what you're looking at. So we need to, it's the best way to get informed.
Thank you. Tyler.
We got a two-parter. Just to go back to what we're talking about a little bit with like that length of the study and how far should we go out and that sort of thing. One way that I like to look at your annual contribution to the reserve fund is that as an owner, you're paying for that year's use of all the common elements, everything that the corporation's responsible for. So your roof and your walls, your windows, your doors, your garage, etc. You're just going to pay your reserve contribution for that year's use of it. And then you keep paying that over the years. When the big project comes due, hopefully, you've been paying that over the years and you just keep paying for that 1 year's use, even though the big $1 million project's going on around you, but you just pay for that 1 year. And that's the whole idea, is you're saving up over time. And that keeps it fair so that, the owner that's been there for a year pays for 1 year's use, and the owner that's been there for 30 years has paid for 30 years, but not more or less, and just try to keep things fair between everybody. I'll say that. And my second part to the two-parter is to just echo Andrew again, which is yes, ask questions, get the faces here to come out to meetings and whatnot, because like my favorite part of the job is trying to explain these things and educate folks. And often that's really helpful. So if you're looking at that study and it looks like gobbledygook, then call Jennifer, call Casey and say, hey, we need to get these guys out and explain it to us, because I think it's really helpful usually to dive into those details, look at all the little nitty gritty stuff, look at the big picture concepts and whatnot, and just understand it so you guys feel comfortable.
Thank you very much, Tyler. And it looks like, I don't know if Casey, if you got a final words of wisdom too, or
Sure.
Take it away.
Sure, I do. I just first of all want to say there's a lot of questions still in the chat, and thank you guys for answering those as we're sitting here while you weren't having to speak. So that was super fantastic. We're going to try and get them all answered, everyone, and we're going to get these questions sent out along with the questions that were sent in sent in advance. If we didn't get them answered, we'll get those answered for you and be able to send those out to everyone who participated. So thanks again. But I think from a reserve fund standpoint, my final words of wisdom are mostly directed to managers and boards and engineers. We're all a team. Communication is key. Our goal is obviously to make sure that it's the best for your community. When I first got into this business, learning reserve funds was very difficult, and the other person who takes a look at them is your auditor. And so I had a project where we didn't have a lot of money in the reserve fund, and nor did we have a huge operating surplus. And there was a huge tree that needed to come down, and landscaping was not a reserve fund component. And we took it down and we paid for it out of the reserve. And then the person who fought me on it was the auditor. And my answer to the auditor was, but it was a really big tree. So that had to matter, right? That mattered because the cost was there. So again, we have to look at all things as they relate to our communities, because as Ian said, potentially, are we replacing one door? Or are we replacing 15 doors? But if you're only 10 units, maybe one door, does qualify. So again, that's why communication on all parts of the team is so important, to know that we're all heading down that same path. So those would be my final words of wisdom. Just because it's a big tree doesn't mean it necessarily qualifies. So.
Thank you. Then are you circling back with the hobbies?
I am. So are we done? I think we're getting ready to wrap up. Thank you to everyone for their time. So amazing. It was so bright here. Thank goodness we had our camera off. You can still see the sun kind of coming in on us. But I was going to say, our reserve funds are now so bright we have to wear shades over here in this room. But hey, thank you very much to Ian Miller, who is a rock climbing avid rock climber. So for those of you who are wondering, thanks to Tyler, who is an avid skier. So thank you, Tyler. Thanks, Stefan, who plays the guitar as his hobby. So thank you very much. Andrew, a vocalist. We didn't give it away that it was actually a Metallica metal band vocalist. So for those of you, you might have guessed that one, I think, potentially. And Jen, I didn't have to ask her hobby, but she's definitely a huge Oilers fan, and that game's on tonight. So she's given up lots of her time to be here with us moderating. So thank you, Jen, as well. Thank you again to all of you for attending. We hope that you found this informative. We will have a recording available in a few days, and we will have all of the questions available as well. Our next session is scheduled in September 2nd, and we will be talking about contracts, particularly probably one of the largest items in your budgets is landscaping and snow removal, and what those contracts should look like and what those expectation levels should be as we, have just gotten through summer and spring and are heading back into, I hate to say it, that snowy winter weather. I know that Tyler loves that because, he's an avid skier, but a lot of us need to know how those contracts look and what we should be looking for and what's included and what's not, and what the right questions to ask are. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. We will get all of the questions answered. Have yourselves a fantastic night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.